Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my watercolor tutorial for painting a cluster of grapes and several leaves. This video is part 1 of a 6-part tutorial. Let's get started. The supplies I use for this project include Arches cold press watercolor paper, 300 pounds. Because I use 300-pound paper, I did not bother to stretch my paper. If you are using 140-pound paper, I do recommend that you stretch it. My process would be to do the drawing first, then lighten up the drawing lines considerably before doing the stretching process. Once water hits your paper, the pencil lines are much harder to lighten up. Use a 2H pencil or a lighter pencil and a kneaded eraser to get your drawing done. Remember that with botanical painting, the more precise the drawing, the easier the process will be for painting it. The watercolor brushes I use include a Black Gold 311 round size 0, a Princeton Heritage 4050 round size 6, a Micro Mini shader size 2, and a tulip angled scrubber brush. This brush is actually a fabric painting brush, and although I've never painted fabric, I have found that this has been a great brush to use as a scrubber for my watercolors. All my paints are Daniel Smith watercolors, and they include Hansa Yellow Light, Yellow Ochre, Transparent Pyrrole Orange, Burnt Sienna, Quinacridone Rose, Quinacridone Purple, Rose of Ultramarine, Cobalt Teal Blue, Sap Green, Green Gold, and Neutral Tint. This painting was inspired by a photograph I found on Pixabay.com. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most of the photographs on this website are both copyright-free and attribution-free. I decided to make a few edits to this reference photo, and I encourage you to also think of your reference photo as a starting point. Always give yourself permission to make changes to that reference photo. First, I chose to crop it differently, leaving out some of the leaves that were distracting me on the left-hand side. And the second edit I made was to increase the exposure, brightening up some of the leaves and some of the grapes on the cluster. So this is the final version of the reference photo that I will use. And here's my line drawing. I start off by spraying water on my palette, getting all the paints activated. It's been a few days since I've been in the studio and it's been warm, so spraying them first like this starts to soften them up. Before I start painting, I take a kneaded eraser and lightly roll it over my entire drawing, lightening up my pencil lines. There are beautiful watercolors where the pencil lines show through, and I know many artists that even go back in and redraw some of their pencil lines to emphasize the drawing in their watercolors. But in the tradition of botanical watercolors, I want to lighten these up so that it is just the watercolor paint that shows through in the end and not necessarily my pencil lines. And in this video, we are going to cover stage 1 for the leaves and a couple of the grapes. Stage 1 consists of painting the lightest lights we see. I apply a weak tea wash of the basic hue I see swiftly to the entire subject area. I start off with the largest leaf, and I'm using a mixture of Hansa Yellow Light and Yellow Ochre. I'm painting this over the entire leaf, even though there are areas in the leaf that are a darker green. The point of this first stage is to get a light coat of color on the entire subject, looking for the lightest shades you see. The only area that would not get painted at this point are any areas that are a bright white highlight. Those areas would just be left as the white of the paper for this initial stage. However, in reviewing the leaves and the grapes, I don't really see any areas that would require me to leave just the bright white paper. So I will paint the entire subject. So this wash really consists of the lightest lights and white of the paper areas if there is anything that is truly a highlight in your reference photo. Once this first wash is dry, I can come in and erase any remaining pencil marks with my kneaded eraser. I do recommend painting this first layer rather swiftly. What I mean by that is not getting caught up in details. This first layer will get covered for the most part with subsequent layers, and we really want to save the details towards the end of our project. At this stage, what we're looking for are the biggest color shifts that we see in the lightest tones. As I study the leaf, I find that certain areas lean more towards yellow, yellow ochre, or a light green. This particular area I'm painting now has a decidedly blue cast, so I'm using watered down cobalt teal. And where that cobalt teal might be a little bit too much of a turquoise, I add just a touch of green gold. The consistency of my paint is weak tea to skim milk. It's pretty watery, and you can see how often my brush goes back into my water to keep my puddles and my brush wet. Along the edges of this area, I see more yellow than blue, so you see me painting those areas in. During this stage, the slowest process is the observation, looking at your subject and figuring out which colors are underlying all those details that can really distract us. Here I'm adding thicker yellow ochre because I definitely see a more decidedly yellow ochre, mustardy yellow, rather than a lime green or lemon green yellow. One advantage of painting leaves is that the veins that run through them create natural stopping points as we continue to load our brush and paint. So if you're finding that you're having a hard time painting sections and getting smooth transitions, maybe you're not painting with wet enough paint, maybe you're not painting quick enough, but try to stop your painting at those veins so that if you do get hard edges as your paint dries, you're getting them in the right place that will help you define the shape of your subject. I'm painting pretty quickly, although this video is sped up to twice the speed at which I was painting. So I'm not too concerned about getting hard edges as I paint quickly. Whenever you see me slow down and consider what to paint next, it's because I'm looking at my reference photo and studying which hue I should be painting in for this undertone. And since we're not painting details, I recommend you use the largest brush you're comfortable using to paint in each subject. The bigger the brush, the more paint and water it carries, and the less often you have to go back to your palette to fill it up again. Every time your brush goes back to your palette to get more paint, your paint on your paper is starting to dry. By using a larger brush, you'll get bigger areas of paint down without risking hard edges. While this is still damp, I go in and add a little bit more cobalt teal blue where I feel that I missed it on my first pass. I'm dropping it into that yellow I painted at the beginning. Most of this light first layer will get covered as we deepen the color with subsequent layers. However, getting it more accurate at the beginning stages means I have to do less color correcting as I build up the painting. Some of these light areas might end up not being touched by second or third layers if I got the color and the value correct at the first stage. Now I'm moving on to the smaller leaves we see towards the center of the painting. There are two leaves here, one lighter and one darker, but I'm still painting the lightest lights I have going on in this subject. I start off with a watery mix of cobalt teal blue, and then before it has a chance to dry, I drop in watery green gold on the upper corner of it. I pay careful attention to the shape and use just the tip of my brush to keep the shape of the leaf accurate. Again, I use watery cobalt teal to do the first layer on the second leaf here in the center as well. I'm painting quickly, but I want to be careful with the edges of my leaves. I want to be sure that I keep the pointy edges where they are. It's easy to paint really casually at this stage, knowing that you'll come in and do color corrections and details later. But don't let that casualness go to the contours of your subject. So you want to keep those contours nice and crisp and clean. And here I'm done with the first layer on these two small leaves as well. I'm ready to move on to the last leaf in the lower corner. Again, I start off with my watery cobalt teal blue and watery green gold. I go back and forth between these two puddles that are on my palette, capturing as closely as I can the color cast I see on the subject. Towards the tip of this particular leaf, there's much more yellowy color. So I dip back into my yellow with yellow ochre and paint that right in while the blues and the greens are still damp so that they blend together. I don't spend a lot of time brush stroking this paint in. I barely touch that yellow to the blue and let it paint itself. I just let the yellow travel into that leafy area. With that yellow ochre still on my brush, which by the way has a mixture of Hansa yellow light in it, I continue painting the edges that I see in my reference photo as more yellowy, and I add some yellow in the interior of this leaf also where I see it in the reference photo. I'm working quickly so that my yellow is hitting the bluish green tones while they're still damp. This ensures I get a nice soft transition between colors. Now I've picked up burnt sienna at a milky consistency, and I'm just tapping it into that yellow ochre that I put on the edges of this leaf. I'm starting to recreate some of the markings I see on that leaf, and the edges have these kind of nice spotted marks between yellow ochre and burnt sienna. I'm still working with the very watery consistency because this is still the stage 1 and maybe stage 2 where we're painting in the lightest colors we see and perhaps the second to lightest colors we see. For the stem, I use very watered down quinacridone rose with a touch of burnt sienna in it, which helps dull it down just a little bit. Notice that I load up my brush and I make my paint stroke. I don't keep picking up my brush and putting it down as I paint that stem. I put it down and I make as long of a stem as I can without constantly picking up my brush and putting it back down. This helps to get these nice smooth edges, which we want for these stems. Even with the stems, I keep looking back at my reference photo to look at how the shade changes. In some areas, the stem has a more pink cast to it. In some areas, it has a little bit more of a yellowy cast. So again, I reach for my mix of yellow ochre and Hansa yellow light. In some areas, it leans more towards green, so I use my green gold. And as I study the cluster of grapes, I'm picking out any areas where these little woody stems show through. I make a puddle of just green gold for some of these stems that are decidedly more green. As I pick my way through the cluster of grapes looking for these stems that poke through here and there between grapes, I keep going back to my reference photo and trying to assimilate how yellow or green or pink each part is. Even at this early stage, I want to get as accurate as I can. You see me often turning my painting around so that I can better access different areas that I need to paint. For example, here I turned it upside down again to get into that stem area. It's much better to figure out what angle your wrist paints better at and keep rotating your painting to better suit your hand and your wrist rather than trying to crank your hand and wrist into an odd angle and paint. And here I'm finishing up the light layer on the rest of the stem. Again, looking for color shifts where it's more green, where it's more pink. Now that we have a first layer on everything except the grapes, it's finally time to turn our attention to those grapes. These grapes will take quite a bit of time to do, so in this video, part 1, I only want to start us off doing a handful of them. In part 2, we will spend the entire hour painting the rest of the grapes. Not only are we painting a lot of small little shapes, but each one is decidedly different than the other. Not only are some more towards green, some towards red, and some towards purple, but within each grape, there's quite a bit of variety, and I want to capture those at this stage. We're definitely painting stage 1 and stage 2, the lightest colors, and the second to lightest colors. And with several of these grapes, we may find that that's all they need. But I want to really focus paying attention to one grape at a time, as if I'm doing a little portrait of each grape. I'm starting off with the bright green ones that really stand out from the crowd, and for those I used the green gold. Notice that I paint around the exterior of it and then lighten up as I go towards the center. On most of these grapes, there's definitely a highlight, and that will help make each grape look three-dimensional, so I definitely want to capture that. After I've picked a few green grapes to paint, I'm moving on to painting some of the grapes that are green and transitioning towards orange. My paint is still at a weak tea to a milky consistency, depending on how light or dark each grape is that I'm painting. For these grapes that I'm working on now, I'm still using green gold as the green base and transparent pyrrole orange as the orange shift. As I paint towards the center and leave that lighter, I also tap on it with my paper towel. I find that that gives me a highlight that has much softer edges than if I just use my paintbrush and leave the white of the paper in the center. That ends up looking more like a colorful donut with a white hole in it. Whereas I discover as I paint each grape that my preferred way of figuring out the highlight is to paint the entire grape lighter in the center and then tap on it gently with my towel to lift out paint. My eye is working around the cluster of grapes, looking for like-colored grapes. First I started with those green gold ones. Now I'm trying to find all the ones that have more of this green to orange transition. This helps me be consistent as I find which ones to paint. I decided to go bold on this one and added quite a bit of that transparent pyrrole orange. And there I go with my towel, just softening up the center. And then I decide to pick up Rose of Ultramarine, one of my all-time favorite colors. and I start painting one of the darkest grapes I see in the background. Even though some of the grapes are extremely dark, at this stage I'm still painting them fairly watery. With these grapes, you really want to take your time paying attention to each one. I also try not to paint next to ones that are wet because I don't want them blending together. It's similar to when we paint all the petals on a flower. I want all of these grapes, just like those petals, to have hard edges and be distinct shapes that are not all blending together. For the reddish and purpley grapes, I'm using quinacridone rose, rose of ultramarine, and quinacridone purple. And I'm mixing them either more towards the purple or more towards the red, according to the grape I'm painting. Don't be in a hurry to get through this stage. I found this to be one of the most pleasurable stages of this painting. Really paying attention to each single grape and trying to capture it as best I can in this first go round. The more accurately I capture it at this stage, the less work I'll have to do at later stages. Since the video is sped up, I do want to let you know that at this point I've been painting for over an hour. And pretty soon I'm going to call it quits because I don't want to just keep painting when I'm tired. If you keep pressing on when you're tired, you'll start painting less from observation and get more mechanical about it. And then your cluster of grapes will really start to be uniform and flat and kind of uninspired. So honor yourself when you're getting tired. Just take a break, whether it's for an hour or for a day. Here I've gone down to a smaller brush to paint the rest of the grapes. I found that that big brush was just carrying too much water and too much paint for each small shape. I wanted to show you this view of my painting and my palette so that you can see just how small each puddle of paint is on my palette. You don't need to have big puddles going, as each shape you're painting is pretty small. Also, I'm not doing a lot of mixing on my palette. The quinacridone purple, the rose of ultramarine, the transparent pyrrole orange, those three little puddles in the lower right-hand corner of my palette are not mixed at all. They're straight out of the tube. I prefer to mix on my brush and on the paper. This ensures that my colors don't just become the same homogenized mix. You can see that I've also gone in really dark on this one grape. It gives me a nice contrast to the lighter grapes and acts sort of as an anchor point to remind me just how dark we're going to be getting with these. So let's get closer again. Here, as I paint behind that green grape, I've ensured that that green grape is entirely dry before I start painting next to it. Again, I don't want the colors blending into each other. I take my time picking my way through these grapes, knowing that even though it's time consuming now, it'll save me a lot of time later. Be sure to tap out the excess paint in the center of your grape for the highlights where you see them. That will mean less having to lift later. I'll still do some lifting at later stages, but by keeping those centers light now, I'm ensuring that I'll have to do a lot less correcting later. There's no one way that's the correct way or the wrong way to paint these. You'll see me sometimes starting with the darkest color on the exterior and working my way into the center for the lightest colors. There I go with tapping out a little bit of the color in the center. Or you can start with the lightest color you see in the center and then work out towards the darker color. And if you find it monotonous, maybe you can go back and forth with different techniques. You can really approach this as each grape gives you the opportunity to practice different techniques and different color mixes. The goal really is to try to make each grape slightly different than any other grape in this cluster. I keep my towel in my left hand handy so that I can constantly keep picking up the highlight I want for each grape. And actually, it's not even a towel that I use. With my watercolor, I prefer to use old t-shirts that I cut up. They're nice and soft and really gentle on my brushes and on the paper. While that little grape is still damp, I tap in the different colors I see in the photograph. For me, I sort of make a game out of it, looking at each grape, and if you get confused and you have your reference photo printed out, you could keep your finger on the grape in the reference photo so that your eye can go back and forth between your painting and your reference photo and go precisely to that particular grape that you're painting. Here I'm starting off with milky consistency of Rose of Ultramarine on my brush, and I darken it slightly for the shadow I see on the bottom part of this grape. I paint in the darkest parts I see first, leaving that white center, and then with just a damp brush, I come in and soften where the paint goes to the white highlight. A damp brush is not a brush that is loaded with water. If you need to, you can clean out your brush in your water and then tap out the excess water on your towel or your old t-shirt, and then you'll have a damp brush. The tip of a damp brush works really well for softening the edges, like I just did on the highlight of this particular grape. While it's damp, I can still go in and either lift out color or tap in slightly different color. Some of these grapes, like the one I'm painting now, will get considerably darker in later layers. So for now, I want to capture the right color, but not go to the extreme darkness. Then my eye goes up to those grapes I painted earlier, and I want to soften that highlight. So with the damp brush, I brush up against both the bright highlight and the color. I reactivate the paint, and then I just touch on it with my t-shirt lightly. Here you see me trying a different technique. I start by painting around the highlight first with that reddish color, which is a mixture of transparent pyrrole orange and just a touch of quinacridone rose and a touch of Rose of Ultramarine. Here I'm painting with just Rose of Ultramarine. I'm letting the colors blend right on the paper. And you can see how funny that little highlight looks if we just leave it like this with such a hard edge. It ends up looking more like a polka dot, as opposed to what I just did here, which was to lift it out with my t-shirt. It gives us a nice soft edged highlight. I go in to paint another grape, and I realize I am starting to get tired. At this point, I've been painting over an hour, and it's not that the painting is exhausting as much as the observation takes a lot of focus. Observing that reference photo and trying to capture what I see. For this grape, I start off with green gold right on the edge, and then I come in and I start painting with a touch of transparent pyrrole orange as I work towards the highlight. On the very shoulder of this grape, I pick up Rose of Ultramarine. It's so fun to play with these colors and let them blend on the paper, looking for all the differences from grape to grape. And then I touch the center with my towel. There's such an infinite variety that we can get on these grapes. For example, this one I'm starting now, I start off with quinacridone purple, and then I add a touch of cobalt teal blue. That cobalt teal blue does a nice job of approximating that chalky surface we see on some of the grapes. And then before any of that has a chance to dry, I come in with Rose of Ultramarine. And now I come in with Quinacridone Rose, Transparent Pyrrole Orange. All these colors blending in this small little shape that's smaller than the size of a quarter. It's really fun to get all these different colors blending together. I'm not going entirely crazy. I am still relating every little grape back to my reference photo. While that's still damp, I add in a little bit thicker transparent pyrrole orange and blend it in. And with this last grape, we've concluded our part 1 of the tutorial for painting these grapes and leaves. In part 2, I'll demonstrate painting the first layer of color on the rest of the grapes. This is what our painting looks like at this point at the end of part 1. I look forward to working up the rest of the painting with you. As always, thanks for joining me.